Hello and welcome to On the Table. We are broadcasting on RTM Click and MyTV's Berita RTM channel 123, which is also live streaming on YouTube. I'm your host, Brandon Paul. Good evening and thank you for joining us as we explore into one of the most important topics, monetary policy and economic resilience here in the country Malaysia. Now on 6 November 2024, the Monetary Policy Committee MPC of Bank Negara Malaysia resolved to keep the overnight policy rate OPR unchanged. Now this is at 3%. Now this rate has remained unchanged since May 2023. Joining us today is Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, Chief Executive Officer, CEO of the Centre for Market Education, CME, to clarify about monetary policy and how its impact on the economy of Malaysia. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
Doctor, first and foremost, what is your perspective on the monetary policy currently being executed by Bank Negara Malaysia?
Well, I think that if we look at the results, so it looks very effective. If we compare what Bank Negara has done in the past few years when compared to the monetary policy that have been adopted in the Western world, we can say that the local approach has been much more prudent, so less aggressive during the downturn that we had at the lockdown time, and so this require less correction later on. And as you have mentioned, we have now the OPR stable at 3% for quite some time, and this has paid well in terms of results. If we look at the graphic that we have in front, we can see indeed the line of the OPR remaining stable, and at that level we have inflation under control, so inflation has remained quite stably below the target level of 2%. At the same time, this has not hindered GDP growth. So GDP keep on growing at a very good pace, in particular in the last couple of quarters, close to 6%. But what is, I think, even more important is that the investment pace has been much more accelerated when compared to the dynamic, the general dynamic of the GDP. And this is a new and very welcome trend that allow for investment, which I believe to be the most important component to create a sustainable model for GDP growth. This is becoming more important than consumption in relative terms, so it's growing faster than consumption. And this is a very good sign, I think.
Now, this is a very good sign, nonetheless, like what you just mentioned. Now, first and foremost, before we dive in deeper into some of the questions that we have for you, can we actually understand in layman terms, how would you actually explain the OPR? Because the younger generations, they are very much into economics. Their concern is basically inflation and how you actually battle it. Prices in the market, they are actually, I would say, relatively high. So how would you actually get them to understand what is this OPR rate all about?
So we may say in very lay terms that is a reference interest rate, which later influence all the decisions that financial operators, banks, makes on their interest rate. So it's a sort of signal that guides decisions on interest rates on the ground. So despite people tend to see it as an automatic mechanism that allow the economy to cool down if you raise it, or the economy to fly if you lower, that doesn't work.
It doesn't work that way, yes.
Otherwise, we could just replace the central bank with a computer. But we don't, because central banking is a much more complicated art and requires a lot of understanding of a dynamic which is complex in nature. So the OPR plays a role within a scenario which is complex, and so it's not just like plane with an engine.
Exactly.
You can switch it off, raise, lower, and then things will magically fall into place. It's one of the tools, is an important tool, but again, as I just mentioned, central banking is more an art than hard science, I would say.
Taking a look at this, right, the light at the end of the tunnel is just not figures, but it's definitely figures to combat inflation as well, to make sure that a particular country remains positive in terms of economic growth. Now, coming back to monetary policy, whatever that you just mentioned, do you think it's adequate for addressing inflation and economic growth?
Yes, I mean, the result speaks for that. As I mentioned, we have inflation under control, the economy on a positive growth path, and in particular investments. So the choices that Bank Negara have made in the past months, I think, are playing well for Malaysia. Of course, people still perceive some tensions on the price level, but this is due to the tail of the choices that have been made during the COVID time. So if we look in particular at how prices changed since March 2020, since that, let's say, negatively magic moment, we see that in particular food and beverage, transport, restaurants and accommodation, and personal care products grew at a faster pace than the average. So in example, food over the past 4.5 years grew by 16%, transport by 17%, and etc. So the people still feel the pinch for that. So despite inflation remaining under control. So when we say that inflation is under control, we don't mean that prices are cooling down or are decreasing.
That's what we expect most of the time.
We are saying that prices are still growing, but at a more moderate pace. But because the most sensitive categories of goods over the past years have grown at a very sustained pace because of the consumer choices and fiscal policies that were implemented, then today, with a lag, people feel the pinch of it. It will take some time before that pinch start to pinch less, let's say.
That's a very nice way to actually put it, Doctor. Now, as we are talking about how prices are on the rise across Malaysia when it comes to various sectors, now, what strategies, in your opinion, should Malaysia consider just to manage inflation while also maintaining steady economic growth?
So, you see, there are different schools of thought about inflation, and I belong to that group of economists that believe that inflation is mainly a monetary phenomenon.
It's a monetary phenomenon.
Always, like Milton Friedman was used to say, is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So, and I make you an example. Okay, if you have 10 ringgit in your pockets, and you use these 10 ringgits to buy 2 goods, okay? And at a certain point, the price of one of those 2 goods will increase. You have to make some choices. Even you buy less than that in order to maintain the same purchase of the second good, or you buy less of or you buy the same of the first and buy less. So in general, in this case, you don't have an increase in prices. You just have a redistribution of the level of price, a change in relative price, and a change in the way in which you spend the 10 ringgit. But you can have inflation if instead of 10 ringgit in your pocket, all of a sudden you have 12. So you can spend more and then pushing up then the prices of all those goods. So this is what will create inflation. So if we embrace that view, that again, is not a view that is, let's say, shared by all the economists in the arena, then we should first and foremost be sure that the quantity of money doesn't grow more than what the GDP does. And given the fact that so far we have seen a very prudent and steady approach from Bank Negara Malaysia, the most important factor to keep under observation is fiscal policy,
Okay.
which means how the government actually spends money. And how that spending is financed.
Right.
With existing money or with borrowed money.
Right.
That is what we need to keep under control if we want to keep the growth of price remaining stably under control as it is now.
Now, you just mentioned the growth of price. Let's talk about the influence of global economic trends. I mean, when it comes to this, including inflationary pressures and supply chain disruptions on Malaysia's monetary policy, we want to get your perspective about this.
Okay, so if we remain to the perspective I just explained, what happened in terms of supply chain disruption can bring a change in the system of relative prices. So a supply side shock, which tends to be temporary. So, of course, it's not good.
It's not good.
It's not good. That has to be maintained as clear. But it can be controlled, and we can hope of coming back from that situation within a certain time frame. So, but I think we have the possibility, at least as Malaysia enters the chairmanship of ASEAN, to remain very much a country which advocates for international free trade, so for trade borders to remain open and vibrant, because this is what ultimately brings advantage to consumers in terms of goods available at an affordable level.
Right. And talking about advantage, we want to talk about the Malaysian Ringgit, because as of late it's trending positively. But we're going to go for a short break and we'll come back here to talk to Dr. Carmelo Ferlito. Stay tuned.
2025 will be a momentous chapter for ASEAN, rich with significance and promise. Will mark the 10th anniversary of the ASEAN community founding, a milestone in our collective journey. Malaysia has chosen the theme inclusivity and sustainability. It reflects our aspirations for shared progress, ensuring that no one is left behind. It conveys our hope that the steps we take today will endure in the long run. It underscores our determination to keep the future firmly in sight as we move forward. On behalf of the government and people of Malaysia, I look forward to welcoming you all. Selamat datang ke Malaysia. Thank you.
And welcome back. We're talking to Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, and before we took break, we spoke about how the Malaysian Ringgit is trending positively, indicating the strength of the country's economic fundamentals and promising outlook. However, what factors are influencing this when we talk about the Ringgit's performance in the global market? And Doctor, what measures should policymakers implement in response?
I think that we need to distinguish, every kind of monetary fluctuation is different. So you have moments in which the strength or the weakness of a certain currency is mainly affected by domestic factors. There are moments in which instead those fluctuations depend on external factors. In many cases, it's a mix of both.
Right.
I think that if we look at what happened in 2024, when we had, at the beginning of the year, a strong depreciation of the ringgit, and then toward the end of the third quarter, a strong recovery in September, and now more or less we are within normal everyday fluctuations. We see that nothing really radically changed over the few months in the Malaysian economy.
Right.
So we may say that what happened to the ringgit was mainly determined by external factors and speculation.
Right.
This is something that we must very much take into account. So, speculation.
Right.
Movements in the currencies, movements on the stocks, so in the stock exchange, are less driven by actual economic fundamentals and more driven by sentiment, by feelings, by expectations, sometimes even overheated expectations. And this is what have really played a role on the ringgit lately. What to expect? Now we are in a moment in which the dollar tends to be very strong for several reasons, while Donald Trump wants it weak. But Donald Trump wants it weak, while at the same time he wants to impose pro-domestic industry measures like tariffs, which are most likely going to further strengthen the dollar. So, but the way in which the new American president is going to play on tariffs, and I think here we will have some surprises. I'm convinced that he's going to play more to use this threat of tariffs for getting something else in exchange and keep the US dollar as a reserve currency rather than really impose tariffs, generalized tariffs as we are reading in the news. And if he plays a more moderate role and game on tariffs, we may have some cooling down of the dollars and, as an effect, a rise of the Asian currencies. And Trump is mainly interested in the yen and the yuan. That's the game that he's trying to play. And the currencies here will just follow. So I don't see radical changes in the fundamentals of the Malaysian economy in the short term. So I don't think that the ringgit will change strongly because of domestic factor, but it will react on the pressures that investors are going to put according to the decisions that are made overseas. So what is important to be done domestically is to keep Malaysia very much on track for open international trade, so vibrant and dynamic in the international scenario, and to play a very diversified approach in terms of international trade. So don't put all your eggs in a basket. Don't be too aggressive in your narrative. Remain open, as it has always been for this part of the world. Play cards with everybody, and so keep the ringgit, let's say, diversified in terms of the things that can play on it.
Doctor, you just mentioned about international trade. Obviously, it's very important. It's of the essence. Now, how do you see Malaysia's financial situation impacting its appeal on foreign investors? I mean, what action should the government take to simply improve this situation?
So if we look at the latest trades, we've seen that international trade is growing, but import is growing faster than export. So our net trade is getting negative more and more. But this is not necessarily good or bad in itself. Sometimes it could be even a sign of strength, because if you have the power to import, it means that your economy has the purchasing power to do so. So we cannot have a univoc way to look at things. Again, as I mentioned, it's important that Malaysia goes ahead with a policy of free trade agreements. And I believe that rather than embracing too generalized and too comprehensive agreements, maybe Malaysia could pursue more a way of bilateral agreements, simple free trade agreements. I can freely trade with you, you can freely trade with me. That's it. Make it simple and sweet. And I think that is the way to go, not only regionally, but also globally. This allows the country to play a more variegate, a more holistic approach on the world scenario. And at the same time, I think a very important role will be played by the reopening of the negotiations with the European Union. That I think is something we should look at with high interest.
Now, Doctor, coming back to this particular question, now you've mentioned some stats and also some graphics. Now, we spoke about how the ringgit is on a positive trend, but this is what we need to ask you. Doctor, how stable is Malaysia's financial sector right now? I mean, given the current monetary policies, if there are any risks, should we keep an eye to ensure financial stability? And what are the risks if there is one?
In terms of the financial system in itself, I don't see heavy risks ahead. The banking system in Malaysia has always been on the conservative side, and I hope this remains the case. From instead the policymaker perspective, what I would keep an eye on is household debt.
Okay.
So it's been closely between 80 and 90% of the GDP over the past few years. And this is putting not the financial system, but the people at risk of their own private financial stability in case of a downturn of the economy. So we need to do all what we can to build a vibrant economic ecosystem, which means to pursue the way of a growth which is investment driven, open not only to foreign investors, but also open to the consolidation of businesses in the country, because I think what keeps our businesses weak is size.
Right.
The fact that 78% of our businesses are micro businesses tells you a lot. So if we want to build an economy that builds not only quantitative growth but also qualitative growth, I think we should imagine policies that help businesses to stay together, to grow together, to consolidate and become more aggressive on the international scenario.
All right, Doctor. Thank you so much for that explanation. And now we just like to move on to digital currencies. As you know, in the internet today, the world of technology, we are also talking about digital currencies and fintech as well. Now, how do you see digital currencies and fintech shaping Malaysia's financial landscape?
Okay, so I have mixed feelings on the
Still mixed feelings.
Cryptocurrencies. No, in the sense that when I first read about them, I think back in 2012, I had big expectations in the sense that I was looking at cryptocurrencies as really the possibility for the government monopoly on the emission of currencies to be challenged. And that would have been a very interesting phenomenon from a purely economic perspective. But instead, now after 12 years, we see cryptos to be mostly a speculative tool. So people invest in cryptos like would invest in bonds, basically. So there is not a different way to look at them. And that has been disappointing me in the sense that we have not pushed probably on the radical way on cryptocurrencies. So as far as they remain a speculative tool, I don't see them to change radically the economic and financial landscape. Another thing is all the discussion about central bank-backed cryptocurrencies. And then I remain skeptical in the sense that the reason why cryptocurrencies were created were to challenge the fact that there is a monopoly on the emission of currencies and legal tender. If then cryptocurrencies become a tool still controlled by the monetary authority, then they are not anymore what they were born for. So they become just another legal tender, just issued in a different way. So it's a contradiction in terms, I would say.
In your point of view, how should we look at cryptocurrencies, honestly?
No, again, I would have liked to see them becoming a way in which people freely... since we have lost the backup of gold in our monetary system, which is, in historical perspective, a very recent phenomenon because it happened in 1971. So only the last 50 years, while in the previous millennia of the history of mankind, there was always a solid anchor for the emission of currency. And this has put a limit to the possibility of inflation. In fact, if you look at inflation in the world economy, since 1971 until now has been much more than what had happened in the previous millennia of the history of mankind. And cryptocurrencies could have become a tool to challenge that, to put a stop at that, and to get, although they are not a natural money like gold was, they being controlled by an algorithm, they could put a rule on top of the growth of money supply. And that didn't happen. So for me, so far, has been a miss occasion, a miss opportunity. So either we change and we go back to that route, or otherwise, as far as they remain a speculative tool, then okay, we look at them as another speculative tool.
Nice. All right, bringing back to fiscal policy. Now, do you think fiscal policy work hand in hand with monetary policy, to get the best of economic growth when it comes to results here in the country?
Absolutely, a coordination is necessary. So whatever the central bank does to control prices becomes at least partially ineffective if the government spends recklessly or create money or keep on borrowing money, incrementing or augmenting the money supply. So it is important that two things go together. In the last budget speech, there was the announcement of measures for further fiscal consolidation. There was clearly indicated the direction to reduce deficit spending, although the way in which this is going to happen was not really explained in detail. So we look forward to what can be announced in order to put that announcement into practice, and if it coordinates with the prudent approach that has been embraced by Bank Negara so far.
All right, Doctor, how does the current monetary situation, when it talks to effect, there will be, unfortunately, positive or negative, when it comes to its effect on consumers' confidence and spending habits in Malaysia, how do you think this monetary situation would actually play a role with the people?
You see, one of the most important points about economic effects and therefore economic policy is communication.
Right.
People react to signals and form expectations based on what they know. And what they know is based on the way in which policies are communicated.
Yes.
So in order to maintain confidence, it is, and confidence has been very fluctuating, consumer confidence over the past quarters, we need to have a consistent and stable communication, which is focused on trust and focus on commitments to the targets that we want to achieve. So price stability in the case of monetary policy, fiscal consolidation and responsibility in the case of fiscal policy. So we need the two authorities, fiscal and monetary authorities, to remain consistent in this messaging, and not only obviously in the messaging, but also in the actual policies that are going to be implemented on the ground to be consistent with those announcements and communication strategy.
Okay. Now, Doctor, unfortunately, we're running out of time. So very briefly, if you can actually explain to us, how does Malaysia's financial landscape compare to its Southeast Asian neighbours? And, if there's any experience to learn from them, what would you think it is? And, how are we doing?
I think it is very difficult to draw a comparison because the situations on the ground are extremely diversified in terms of political regime, so policy landscape. I would say that Malaysia, in terms of monetary and financial stability, has been probably more stable than what we see in our neighbor countries, and therefore the adjustment policies that need to be done are less aggressive, and let's keep it as it is.
Let's keep it as it is. Right. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us on the table right now. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. And that's it from us on the table this evening once again. So we've been speaking to Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, Chief Executive Officer, CEO of the Centre for Market Education, CME. Now, good news is that a repeat of these episodes broadcast can be viewed again at the same time tomorrow and subsequent days on both RTM Click and MyTV's Berita RTM channel, which is also live streaming on YouTube. Till next Thursday, where we'll be discussing another topic of interest. Till then, I'm Brendan Lepal, signing off. Take care.